Hi, I'm Elizabeth Fleur, and welcome to another painting demonstration. If you are interested in a loose painting technique, I hope you have already found my video, which shows how I painted this floral using wax paper, negative painting, and a bit of imagination. I think there's a lot to learn from that video, and I'm not going to repeat it all here in this new one. So if this video makes you feel like you're coming in the middle of the story, you know where to find the beginning. Look for Floral Splash on my YouTube channel. That first painting was done in acrylic ink, and after its success, I decided to try the same loose technique with variations in watercolor. So that is what this video is all about. Here is my finished watercolor painting, done without a photograph or live flowers, and without a pencil drawing, just like the first one was. Before I started painting, I chose the 3 tubes of paint on the left. Later, I added 2 more paints so that I could get some darker values. I didn't make these color samples before I started. I made them for this video to help explain how watercolors worked differently than acrylic inks did, and that main difference is value. More on that later. I taped off the edges of my watercolor paper with Artist's acid-free tape, but that is totally optional. I'm ready to get going on my underpainting. I squeezed out fresh paint from my first 3 tubes using a styrofoam plate as a palette. I'll just say the paint on a plate keeps me from adding new paint choices in the heat of the moment. And if you have any temptation to try to make roses red and leaves green, a limited palette will stop you in your tracks. You will get a unified painting and can use any of your colors freely throughout it as you paint away from the edges to reveal your subject. This time I didn't do an underpainting over the whole page. I knew I could always add more underpainting later. There is a certain flexibility in leaving some of the paper white until later in the process. I see several benefits to starting with at least a partial underpainting. First, it lets me get started on the painting without tedious pre-planning. It breaks up the scary white of the paper in a non-threatening way. This spritzy type of underpainting automatically gets me off to a loose start to a painting that is intended to be loose. By serendipity, the underpainting may tell me where to begin when I am ready to start defining a subject. And depending on where you put your first flower, it may mean the frontmost part of that flower already has color and isn't a stark white as you start your negative painting. If you try this method and want something other than white flowers, you can deliberately put more color on your underpainting in some area and then start your first flower there. But don't go so dark with your underpainting that your negative painting away from the petal edges doesn't show. By the way, I didn't tip the pad at all for this painting. I spritzed the paper before adding any watercolor, and then spritzed it again when the paint was being lethargic and refusing to move. I have gradually realized that the paint doesn't move much when there is a dome-shaped water droplet sitting there on the paper. The paint seems perfectly happy to add to the droplet without feathering out. I also suspect that opaque paints like to sit still more than transparent paints do, but I can't promise you the validity of that theory. Throughout this video, I'll note when I dried the paper before proceeding. Between steps, I always waited for the surface water to evaporate naturally. And then I finished the drying process with a heat gun. There is a magic moment when just the right amount of spritzed water is still sitting on the surface of the paper and the paint travels the spritzed highway in a feathery way. After that, the water soaks into the surface of the paper and the paint moves in a different way, creating soft edge dots of paint that are also useful. But what I always try to avoid doing is stroking the paint with my brush. I established this rule for myself so that I don't take over and control where the paint goes. No, the water paints the painting. If you try a painting like this, that is an important mindset. Even if you have a brush in hand, do not make brush strokes. All movement of the paint should happen because water does it for you. I've decided that this time I'm going to paint a flower that has multiple layers of petals making up each flower. If you've seen my other negative painting videos, you know that I'll be finding edges, deciding what is closer and what is farther away, and putting the paint on the farther away part, petal by petal. I cannot slip by mistake back into painting the positive because the petal will be covered up by wax paper. The frontmost petals will happen first, with me finding their edges with a wax paper template. So here I go with the petals closest to me in this particular flower. The paint is going in the negative space around this whole group of petals. Still, this will not be any particular kind of flower. In fact, I can hardly identify any flowers beyond rose, tulip, and daisy. So if you recognize a flower species in the end, it is only by chance that I have painted something that looks real to you and has a name. In the acrylic ink painting, I always added acrylic ink to the painting with an eyedropper directly from the ink bottle. So there was no mixing color before the paint hit the page, and it mixed there on its own. So that is one immediate change I get with watercolor, the easy ability to mix color variations on the palette. Not only can I mix colors on the palette, but I can dilute them with water on the palette to create darker and lighter versions before touching them into the spritzed water. With the acrylic inks, the paint was going on at full strength at all times. For the next round of petals, I put the same wax paper back in position and draw with more care that second layer of petals going back in space in my imagination. I was careful not to draw a red Sharpie onto the watercolor paper. I'd like something different to happen with this flower. Maybe it will be a little distorted, or maybe it will be turned. The single petal I drew is really another petal from the top layer of this flower, no problem. I put the first stencil back in position so I can tell where the second stencil fits. I was just being stingy with wax paper, and it would be easier to start with a fresh whole piece of wax paper each time. I often wanted to spritz the water from higher above the paper, and that is why the spray bottle doesn't always show. Sometimes I deliberately spritzed closer than the ideal height. just so the spray bottle is caught by the camera. As I'm touching on the paint, I'm always asking myself, is this paint dark enough to define the new edge even after the paint dries? I lifted the stencils with an exacto knife just to avoid smearing paint with my fingers. After the stencils are out of the way, I am able to judge things better, and I decide to add the darker brown to my palette. I don't want this painting to be too wimpy. And now is the time to start incorporating a darker value and reinforcing the visibility of these edges. The paper is still wet, so the new paint is still going into wet areas and doing its own thing. By the time I'm nearly done adding brown, however, some of the paper is getting too dry, so it helps to add more spritzed water. Throughout the process, I often did some final spritzing to the new edges to soften up those edges a bit. The new spritzing puts a little water inside the petal edge, and when paint flowed there, it loosened up the look of the edges. Remember, you can change your mind with Kleenex. With a fresh piece of wax paper in place, I'm outlining the petals that already show. This will help me position my newest stencil when it's ready. I've decided to bring in another kind of blue that can create a darker value. So now I have all 5 paints on my plate. I don't expect to do more layers of negative painting in the upper right corner, so it's a good time to fill that area with colors. I'm already aware that if I left the corner white, it would draw the eye and be confusing as we try to see the flower. And then off comes the stencil, and on goes more spritzed water to soften the newly created edges. And a few touch-ups of additional paint, something I can't judge until the stencil is out of the way. Because this approach is all wet and wet, the watercolor paint is always being diluted on the watercolor paper. And it can be challenging to get a sufficient range of values happening to define multiple layers of negative space. I bring this up so that when choosing your own paint colors, you will look for those that can give you a range of values from light to dark. The top row here shows my paint choices, put on the paper directly from the tube, and diluted as little as possible. At first glance, the dark brown is going to offer a nice dark value, and so will the dark blue. The second row are the same paints pretty much straight from the tube, but applied wet and wet. So I can show you how much lighter the values will be on a wet and wet painting like the one I'm doing. I converted the picture to black and white, which makes it quite clear what the range of values is. Now the range of values in the second row is disappointingly narrow. My darkest darks when painted wet and wet are not very dark at all. I have to be aware of this as I create more edges, or the painting will all be too weak and washed out, and the edges might not even show well. I'd say this is the biggest difference between using acrylic ink versus watercolor with this technique. It was harder to achieve dark enough darks with the watercolor paints. At this point, I've finally decided what the orientation of this painting will be, and it's the same one you've had all along. I'm kind of turned off by all the brown in this painting, and it will take me many steps before I get comfortable again and solve my brown problem. You'll notice that for a while I'll be steering clear of brown. I've designed the next flower inside an oval, but I didn't cut out the flower center yet. This new flower, when it has all its petal layers, will be very close to the first flower and probably be behind it. But for now, the closest petals are out here, a distance away from the first flower. I'm focused on using blues and greens for now. The next layer of petals gets defined by more blues and greens. I don't think avoiding brown is doing this painting any favors. Do you agree when you see this result? Without a center, the flower is especially hard to interpret, so I put a little piece of blue tape there. Then I proceed with a third layer of petals on the right side of the flower. I am just not making good decisions. See how I got freaked out by adding more brown? I had to blast it away completely. And I can't say it's much better after the second attempt. Somehow I got this painting turned around 180 degrees for this step. Maybe it means the painting is going belly up. That last blue edge was a dud, so I put the stencil back on and gave the negative space another layer of paint. So I want you to know that you can return to punch up existing edges if you want to. And then I cut a little angular hole in a scrap of wax paper so I could start indicating the center of this flower. It will seem puny at first, but that is deliberate restraint on my part. And later in the painting, I'll develop it further. Here's an unfortunate way to make another layer of petals on the left side of the flower. I grabbed an existing stencil from my table to reuse, and that thoughtlessness caused me much dissatisfaction. That stencil was just awfully trite. 3 equal scallops that were beyond boring. I guess I was ready to use more brown by this point, because I knew it would never work to have brown only in one part of the painting. And some pretty nice things happened out here on the white part of the paper. I used the negative space of these new petals to extend color where there was no underpainting. And I was very pleased with the variety of colors, including grays, that happened. While doing this step, I also added more paint to disguise some brown blobs I didn't like. This is how the painting looks at this point. Despite all my complaints, it's coming along. I can even say something nice about how the browns are getting integrated across the page. Both flower centers need some work, and I hate the scallop shapes big time. Something must be done. I doubt that too many people have the patience or interest to watch me finish this painting blow by blow. But in case anybody wants to watch the video, I'm going to include it at a greatly sped up rate. And you can slow it down yourself below the video. Here are a few comments that won't be repetitive of things I've said before. There are lots of times when you may wish to darken a particular edge, and as long as the paper has been spritzed with water, you can go back anytime and add paint where you want it without having a stencil in place. At one point in finishing this painting, I brought in some real leaves from outside and just had a little fun doing negative painting away from real leaves. They don't lie nice and flat like a piece of wax paper, so it was a little frivolous. One of my cures for that ugly uniform scallop was to use my flat brush with clean water and do some lifting to change the shape of the scallop a little bit. I think it helped a lot. I added leaves in 2 corners and I think I regret it now. I think I could have used some nothing space with no subject in it. In the end, I was happy with this painting, but I do find it a little fussy. And the flowers are almost too real. I think I prefer my first floral splash, where more was left unsaid.